Hi, I'm Susan Sexton Wood, and I've been saved by grace. Through my childhood, I had a lot of ups and downs. I grew up in low-income housing in northern Kentucky and was raised by a single mother that suffered from alcohol addiction. I can remember a lot growing up. My mom would be drinking in the morning when I go to school. She would be drinking when I come home from school, and even when we went to bed. That was probably 80% of my childhood is remembering that my mom struggled with addiction, and she would bring home different men from the bars, and eventually got married to a stepdad that was very abusive to her. So just growing up, I seen a lot of things that I definitely shouldn't have seen, and experienced things that most children shouldn't experience in their childhood. One of my biggest memories, and really my first memory that I remember, is just being sexually abused, which carried out a lot of my childhood. It was like a revolving door. It always happened. Today, I know that I don't blame my mom for the choices she made. I don't blame her for my own addiction. I realize that she had issues too, and it takes us to change ourselves. And so through my childhood, I just remembered that I didn't want that kind of life. I didn't want to be a mother that raised her kids in low-income housing, and I wanted to be a productive member of society. So early on, I went and got a job and worked from, I believe, the age of 14 or 15. I can't remember exactly what the age was allowed at that time. But I still had the desire to change my life so that it didn't resemble where I grew up. My mom would actually buy me alcohol, and I could invite friends over, and we had parties, and that was the kind of mom she was. I can remember taking my first drink at about the age of 13. From then on, I didn't see a problem with me drinking. I would do it, and I would hang out with friends, and it was pretty much always on the weekend. But today, when I look back at my life, I could see each year how it progressed a little bit. We would have parties all the time. With friends, I got fake IDs and would go into bars. And so at the age of 18, I met someone, and very quickly I became pregnant. And so when I had my older son, life started to change. And at this time, I still drank, but I justified it as I'm just drinking wine coolers. And so I got a good job and just kind of sunk into the life of having a family. The man that I was with, we definitely bumped heads probably early on in the relationship, and I would say almost at the beginning, probably 4 months into it. But I had a child now, and one of the first things he said is that we needed to get married. And I didn't want to get married just because I was pregnant, and I wasn't a Christian at this time, so we didn't get married. When he was about 18 months old, we decided to get married. I thought that getting married probably would help our relationship when it come to the mental and physical abuse. And so I always, at that time, it seemed like I was always trying to fulfill something in my heart with things that were physical. And today I know that the answer is not trying to fulfill it with something that I could actually touch. And so we decided to have another child. And when I got pregnant for the second time, instantly had some trouble with the pregnancy. And so we kept the routine of going to the doctor and doing things that I needed to do. I couldn't really work because of the pregnancy. And in 6.5 months into the pregnancy, I was told that my son had passed away. And that is the first time that I remember being prescribed what people call a nerve pill today, which was a Valium. because they sent me home and said that I needed to let the child put me into labor, and I just needed to go home, and that's how I needed to deal with it. I can remember after 3 days of just being in bed and crying and thinking, why is this happening to me? I just called the doctor and said, we've got to do something. I can't live like this. It's not right for someone to live knowing that their child is dead, and there's nothing that can be done. And in waiting to be put into labor, it could have taken months. And so the doctor put me into the hospital, and they tried to prepare me all night for what I was going to see when it come to my son being born. They told me that he would be a pound or two. I'd be able to hold him, and his skin would be peeling because of him being deceased. And that's definitely not what we got when I gave birth to him. He come out in a blood clot, and I wasn't able to hold him, and he didn't weigh a pound or two. He actually weighed 73 grams. And when it comes to a death certificate, you can't get one if the weight is not a certain amount. And so we decided to baptize our son, and they would have to do an autopsy, but we decided that we were still going to baptize him and bury him, and today he does have a grave. So going through that, like today when I look at my life, I still can't understand why that happened. That's one thing that I still have to work on, and I'm a person that likes to know why things happened in my life, whether I made the decision to do it or if something just happens, why it happened. And so I continued on in my marriage, and things still didn't get any better, and there was still emotional and physical abuse. We decided about 6 months after that to have another child. I think at that time I thought, well, a lot of the problems is because we lost a child now, and I try to justify what was happening. And so we very quickly became pregnant again, and this pregnancy was a little bit different. I could work, and I wasn't sick all the time with the pregnancy, which was way different. And the birth was probably the easiest one that I had too. And we had another son. Continuing in the marriage, I again would look for another job because maybe that would make me happy, and we'd get a different car thinking that would make me happy, go get clothes and shoes, and maybe that would make me happy. And none of the physical things could change the way that I was feeling. And we decided to separate, and when my kids were 6 and 3, and we tried quite a few times, and I think for probably 2 years we tried back and forth to get back together, and if we could work on things. And I think a lot of that was on my part, because I grew up without a dad, and I didn't want my kids to grow up without a dad also. And so I wanted to do everything I could to try to save the marriage. I can remember thinking I needed to put my kids before my feelings and my thoughts when it come to the marriage. Today, I again have learned just from going through that I have to be well, and if I'm not well, I can't take care of my family. And so we did end up divorcing. Very quickly, while I was going through the separation, and which led to divorce, I started drinking a lot more. It was every day on the weekend, and it started leading into sometimes during the week. At this time, we shared custody of our kids, and that lasted for a couple years until eventually they were fully in my custody. Probably about this time, I met someone else, very active in drinking. At this time, I had started buying methadone off the street, and self-medicating is what I was doing. I had tried marijuana a few times, didn't really care for that. And that's pretty much the drug use that I had tried at that point. And so when I was in this new relationship, quite a few months into the relationship, I became pregnant again. And we actually talked about having a child, and I said, if by the time I'm 30, if we're not pregnant, then I want my tubes tied. I'm not going to have any more kids. And I found out 2 months before my 30th birthday that I was pregnant. And so during this pregnancy, it was probably the hardest pregnancy that I had gone through, and probably even a little bit harder than losing my son, my second pregnancy, because I was so used to drinking and doing something, a mind-altering substance. I was so used to it, I couldn't do it when I was pregnant. And there was a point in my pregnancy when I went out and got a bottle of alcohol, and I took some Xanax because of the way that I was feeling. And I was a self-medicator, so I became really depressed in that pregnancy, wasn't able to turn to the alcohol and drugs, and I think that's what actually led me to doing it that one time that I did. And so I ended up giving birth to my fourth child, and also a boy. And during this time, me and his dad, I didn't really understand a lot about cocaine addiction, crack addiction, heroin addiction, but I started to learn more about it. He was addicted to crack cocaine, and a lot of times in the pregnancy he would disappear for days at a time, and I didn't really understand that. I can remember trying to tell him, you're going to lose us as a family if you keep doing that. And today I know that even that doesn't work unless somebody really wants to change their life. And so I gave birth to my son, and I had a friend that I used to actually take to go buy her heroin. And when I would take her to go do that, every time she used, she would get sick. And so that's the first time that I ever used heroin, and the reason that I wanted to use it was because I just had a child and I wanted to lose weight. And it's very ironic because you don't hear many people saying that's why they chose to use a drug the very first time. And it didn't make me sick. About a month into using, the person that I was with, we talked about me using heroin, and he used to tell me, heroin, oh no, you're not using that. And he tried to justify a difference in crack and heroin because his addiction was crack. And so I quit using the heroin after about a month, and my son was still a newborn, and his dad decided to go on a crack binge, which led him to Florida. And so I had his 3 kids, my 2 older boys, and we still had a newborn, living in an area where you couldn't really walk to go get anything. And so I needed help, and I had to call in the authorities to help me because my son needed some formula. And so when they come in, they actually took his 3 kids because I wasn't their mother. And so that ended up leading me to another state where I had to ask for help from my sister to stay with her for some time to pick myself back up. And again, I still would drink. I remember one time I left and she watched my kids, and I ended up in jail on my birthday, and my 12-year-old was feeding his brother and changing his diapers, and that kind of stayed my life for a little bit. My older son always was watching his younger 2 brothers. I would go to the bar. It wasn't the weekend anymore. It was during the weekday. There was many times that I woke up and I didn't know where I was, and my kids was always late to school, and my older son didn't know where I was. And I know that that's affected his life tremendously because of the choices that I made. Within, I want to say 2 years, within 2 years, I was now using heroin again, and this time I was shooting heroin. And my youngest son's dad, my fiance at that time, was back and forth in jail, and he was doing a 2-year prison term. And so when he come back home, I was addicted to heroin. And we started using each other's drug. He started using heroin, which he said he would never touch, and I start using crack, which I said I would never touch. I always try to justify the difference in crack and cocaine and heroin, and whether it was marijuana or drinking. Today I know none of that is good for me. It's all a mind-altering substance, and all of it has caused problems in my life, and that's when you know it's an addiction. And so when he come home from prison, a couple years, we were definitely enabling each other, and he would use my drug and I would use his, and it became a combination. On January 1st, 2011, I woke up next to him dead of overdose, and we enabled each other. It was our 9th year anniversary, and we partied all night. There was a lot of things that happened that night that I think about, and definitely wish that I could have done things over. I couldn't understand why his life was taken and I was still here, because he was the type of person, even if he didn't have any money and even if he didn't have a place to stay, he loved life. He always had a smile on his face and he always enjoyed life. And for me, I didn't. I was a miserable, hateful woman, and I hated life. I hated it. I tried to take my own life 3 times. And so I didn't really understand that. And my addiction spiraled way out of control. I got a lot worse because I blamed myself for his death, and I couldn't understand why his life was taken and mine was saved. And so in November of 2011, I remember just wanting something different. I wanted a different life, and I really didn't know how to get it. So I called a friend, and I ended up in another part of the state and went to the state hospital. And there was the first time that I walked into a place and I told them I was a heroin addict and I needed help. I know when I think about that first step today, saying I was a heroin addict was the hardest thing that ever come out of my mouth. And so it took hours to get into the state hospital. And I was there for about 11 days after they accepted me. But my mind started doing something different. I knew that I was in a lockdown facility, so my detox was a little bit easier, because today I know it has a lot to do with my mind too. And so I embedded myself in any kind of program they had, and constantly talking about the way I was feeling and what I needed to do to try to start changing that. After 11 days, they told me that I needed to leave because they were releasing me, and that's all they could do for me. And I remember asking them to please help me get in an inpatient facility. I wasn't ready to go back out there. They said they couldn't help me and that I was being released. I want to say that night, I think I drank after being released that morning. And so very quickly I was back into the same thing that I always knew, which led me back to my hometown. And within 7 days of being back there, I was now back on heroin and now had a prostitution charge. But one thing that I didn't forget is that I wanted to change my life. And so I decided to leave that area again, and I walked into another hospital. And at this time, I begged them for help. I told them if they didn't help me, the next time I shot dope would be the last, because I was going to kill myself, that I was begging for their help. And so they put me in a psych unit. And after 5 days of being in there, again, they tell me that I needed to be released because they couldn't do anything else for me. And at this time, I was mad. I was frustrated, and I was begging for help. And everybody, it seemed like they were just turning their back on me. I was given a couple numbers earlier that day, and I had called the inpatient facilities and hadn't got any response. And I was yelling and cursing and asked them, when you release me, just give me a needle, have me equipped when you make me leave, and to make it easier for me to use. And this is when I took the time and I went back to my room, and I can just remember closing my eyes and seeing a vision of my 3 boys and just calling out to God. I prayed for him to help me. And that's the first time that I really took the time to pray. I feel like I always talked to God because I believe that there was a God, but I didn't understand what he could do for my life. And within 30 minutes of that prayer, I got a call for one of the facilities that I had left the message for. And the lady asked me where my clothes were, and that she was coming through there the next day and that she would stop and see me. And so she come and talked to me, and that day I left with her. And I was in a Christ-centered facility that is ran by donations, and I was able to start moving forward with my life. I know on the ride there, she asked me what I planned to get from that program, and I just said that I was broken and that I want it to be fixed. And so when I walked into that facility, I can remember that I wanted something different, and I thought to myself, I'm just going to leave the old Susan out here. And I started embedding all of my thoughts, all of everything I did. I really paid attention to the program, and I started to learn how to pray for myself. Everybody does something different when they have a connection with God and they start building their relationship. One of the first things that I prayed, because I had a hard time shutting my mind off. And when I would lay in bed at night, it was almost like a grocery list of emotions. It wasn't the eggs, milk, and bread that I needed, but it was my fiance had died of overdose. I lost custody of my kids. I've been in the hospital twice, almost losing my arm because of the use of heroin. I had been in jail and in the psych unit numerous times now. And so I was homeless and definitely lost, and I couldn't get my mind to slow down. And so my prayer was that I asked God to help keep my heart strong and my mind open to recovery. And that was my prayer for a long time. And I can remember today just thinking about how my mind wouldn't shut down, and I was consumed by my thoughts, that it's way different today. And so in that program, it was just a program for women, and we became very close. We always depended on each other. We prayed for each other. We were in class together, and we cried and laughed, and I was feeling a lot of different things that I hadn't felt before. In that program, there was a class called Bound and Chained, Unchained Praises. And God had me clinging to that name, Unchained Praises. And so I started to write down what he was feeding through me, what thoughts and what he was speaking to my heart about this. I know when I prayed about it, and I went to my Bible, he took me to a verse that says that I will work a work in your day that you will not believe, even if I told you. And today I remember that. Like, he's definitely changed my life. Back to that program, it was a 6-month program at the time, and I decided to leave after 4 months of being in the program. And I went back to the area that I grew up in, back to my hometown, which quickly led me again to drinking and drugging. One thing different about this time when I relapsed is that spiritually, I missed God. I missed that part of my life. And so I tried to pick myself back up, and I went to an outpatient program that was Christ-centered. It was an intensive outpatient program, and I went through that program, and I finished that program. And again, I relapsed. Again, I missed the spiritual aspect of my life, and I didn't stop wanting to be different. And so after being in a relapse for a little while, I actually got a hold of my mom and asked her if I could come stay at her house while I called other facilities, because I knew I needed to get back into a facility and start building that structure that I had learned before. And while waiting on a facility, I was getting a lot of responses of 2.5 months before I could get into a place. And so during the time that I was waiting, I got a call that someone told me U.S. Marshals were looking for me. And so I knew that I wanted to change my life, but I also knew now that I had a warrant for my arrest and I had to do something about it. So I made the decision to turn myself in. It definitely wasn't an easy decision, but it was truly, today, it was the best decision that I could have made instead of running. And so I turned myself in, and I found out that I was wanted for trafficking heroin. The more that I found out about the charge, the more that I was told it was almost 2 years old. I had never been arrested for it. And so they charged me with it in 2013, and it happened in 2011. And so I still wanted something different. And when I was released out of jail, I didn't have to stay long. I think it was about 4 days when I turned myself in. I, again, started thinking of that first facility that I was in, which is in Richmond, Indiana. And I knew that there was a second facility there. So I started praying about that, and I remembered the name, and I made the call to see about what the process was to get in there and how long of a wait it would be. And after I called, they took my information down, and I believe it was 4 days later that I was actually in that facility. And so when I got back into that facility, and it was a transitional facility, Christ-centered, I started to apply everything I knew about recovery and what I had learned before to my new sobriety date. 2 months into that program, I was asked to speak. And I went, and the biggest thing that I remember speaking, I went back to Northern Kentucky, and I spoke in front of 240 people. And the biggest thing that I remember sharing is that there is a difference in recovery and sobriety. And even though my sobriety date changed, my recovery time didn't. And so I could take everything that I had learned and I could apply it and then figure out why I relapsed and work on the reason for my relapse, but still utilize the tools that I had learned in my recovery. And so I still remembered what God had told me about Unchained Praises. And I was going through this charge that I turned myself in. I was in a facility. I was now working. God opened a door for a vehicle. And I started making plans to move forward with Unchained Praises. After finishing that program, I got an apartment and had a roommate. And so I started the Facebook page of Unchained Praises. And what God was working through me is to work with people in inpatient facilities and to try to bring the community together to show that addiction affects everyone and not just the addict. So the very first post for Unchained Praises started off with a thought for today. And that has been happening now for over 4 years, where I just pray and start typing and see what God brings out. And so at this time, still a roommate living in an apartment. I didn't have custody of my kids, but I kept continuing to move forward. And so on September the 24th of 2013, I was sentenced for the charge. And a couple things I did as I learned about the charge and I had to go meet with my attorney, I was given a choice, either a 2.5-year plea or to go in front of the jury. And I prayed about what I needed to do. That's one thing I've learned in my recovery is I pray about everything and I don't jump into any situation because I cannot run my life, but God can. And so when I prayed about it, God told me that the same result was going to happen. It didn't matter which one I did. And so I called my attorney and I signed that 2.5-year plea for prison. And so on after I signed that plea, I went back and I prayed and I asked God what was going to happen. And so he told me that he would not put old with new and I would find grace. And that I can tell you that was the easiest thing that I ever did, was to just trust in him and walk in faith that what he told me was going to happen. And when I went to go be sentenced on September 24th of 2013. My sister had had custody of my son for about 2.5 years. And I told her after I walked out of the courtroom that day, I was going to start process to get custody back of my son, which the state of Kentucky had taken my rights. I had no rights to him. She had full legal custody of him. And so she said, well, when you go to court, you're going to prison for 2.5 years. And I said, well, no, God told me I wasn't, and I believe him. So I'll call you when I get out of this courtroom. And so I went into the courtroom, and my lawyer laid out everything that I had done for my recovery, and that the reason for this charge is not the reason that I started to get better, that I started getting better before I even knew about it. And so the judge says that she believed me, and she didn't accept that 2.5-year plea. She actually gave me probation. And so I did exactly what I said, and I started the process to get my son back. I know that when we make decisions on our own, we can make a mess of them. And so when I prayed about what to do, and I started following what God told me to do, and I asked him when my son was going to come home, and he told me that it would be in December. So I was sentenced at the end of September, and the papers for my son was signed in December of 2013. And the only stipulation that I had was to wait until Christmas break and to go get him. And I can tell you that I reside in Indiana, and I didn't even have to go back to Kentucky to have the papers signed. I didn't have to be there. The judge signed them without me being there. And so I've learned a lot of things in my recovery. When the world tells me one thing, I pray about it. And when God tells me another, I follow what he tells me. Because the world had me locked up, and God told me that he was bigger. And so that didn't happen. And the world told me that I wouldn't get custody back of my son. And God told me different. And so God's bigger than any courtroom, and he can do what many think that he can't. And I also have been through, I contracted hepatitis C through my heroin use. And when I prayed about that, I went through the treatment in 2014, and God had told me that he was going to heal me, and he has. And so I no longer have hepatitis C. So I think the biggest thing that I try to share with people is that there is hope after addiction, and that God is bigger. And if you just allow him to run your life, he will make the choice that you can't make, and the best result will happen. Since choosing recovery, I've continued to move forward with Unchained Praises. We have gone from having events to bring the community together to having one-on-one personal recovery plans that we sit down and help individuals work. Because if we build our recovery, it's going to last longer. If someone tells me what to do and they lay it out for me, the odds of that fitting are very slim. So God's opened up a door for me to become a certified community health worker and a certified recovery specialist. We have 4 offices in Indiana, and we're opening an office in Kentucky, which it's been open a couple weeks now. And we have a recovery specialist, which is now our Kentucky director, heading that office up. We continue to move forward, and just whatever God tells us to do, we do. There is a board of directors, and we are a 501c3. For somebody to tell me that I could never do anything with my life, God told me different. And today I am a recovering heroin addict, but at the same time, God has changed my life around so much that I would have definitely never believed that. And that goes back to the verse that he gave me. And I know I can't say this right, but it's Habakkuk 1, I think, 1, verse 1. And it just says that he will work a work in my day that I would not believe. And I go back to his promise. And so through that, I think about my life in the past. And so I do reflect on my past a lot. However, I don't dwell on it. I am not thankful that I am an addict, and I'm not thankful that I lost my fiance due to overdose. However, I am grateful for that. and I see what God did. When I had the questions of why did you take him but you didn't take me, I understand that today because he had a mission for me. And when he put Tim, which is my fiance's name at that time, when he put Tim into my life, Tim talked about God a lot, and he showed me compassion, and he showed me he embedded in my life things that I didn't have. And so I remember that today. And so I understand why God took him and left me, because today Tim is the face of Unchained Praises. And as we continue to move forward, and as we have been moving forward, I embrace my future. I'm married today, and so my life has definitely changed. Today, my job is a motivational speaker, and it is trying to encourage other people that don't believe that they can change their life. We're here to show them that they can. Another thing that God has done this past year, 2017, is I started writing an article in Winchester, Indiana called Let's Talk Recovery. And from that, it's opened doors for us to have our own talk show, which is called Let's Talk Recovery. And we have the same concept. We bring in different people to share what addiction has done to their life, and not only the addict, but the family members of addicts. And we bring in professionals to share what addiction has done to their life because of their job and how they interact with people that struggle with addiction. I want to introduce you to someone else that come with me today, and she's going to share her story. This is Kathy Legere. I was in the first inpatient that I went to. I was in the facility with her daughter. And Kathy has become the first volunteer for Unchained Praises, and she has been with us from the very beginning, and now she is in our Connorsville, Indiana office. She is a mother trying to help other parents and addicts try to overcome addiction and to help people understand what addiction has done to their life. So I'm going to ask Kathy to share.
Yes. I met Susan in February of 2012, as she said, at the Crossroads facility, which is a wonderful facility where my daughter was. They became great friends, and so Susan and I became good friends. And I've seen such a progress in Susan, and it's really, really pleased me. Unfortunately, we went down a very rough road, and I lost my daughter in September of 2013. She had, she was struggled for many years with substance abuse. She was very depressed. She did have 3 children, which I was taking care of. Her 3rd child was born drug addicted. So at the age of 55, I brought a newborn home, and I had the children for 18 months, and of course parental rights take over, and so the fathers kind of stepped in. Today I do have the 2 older children who I'm guardian of. But we'll go back to January of 2009. My oldest son, Brian, who had always been such a responsible, good boy, played sports, was just wonderful at everything, and so responsible. But the addiction and the struggles that he had with substance abuse also. And we lost him then in January of 2009. In 2009, it was still a shameful disease. People didn't want to talk about it. And I really didn't know how to handle it. I'll be honest, I was not good with my children in their struggles because I didn't understand. Today I see the need that we have for transitional housing. You know, the jails have become a revolving door because they put them in, they send them out without any tools, without any help. You know, they're setting them up for failure because by that time, the family, and you do get exhausted. They wear you out. The lies, the chaos, the drama that exists with an addict wears you out. And so you become, resistant to help them. You pull away from them. And so when they have no help, when they have nowhere to go, then they fall right back into the addiction, the same thing that they came out of. So my children didn't really, some people have told me that going to prison saved their life. They didn't really have, other than minor instances where they fell into the system. So Brian actually never went into a treatment facility. He did do the 12 steps. He did have his coin. He was actually, before he came with me outside of Indianapolis, he was an assistant manager at Walmart. As I understand, he hurt his back. So they, of course, prescribed the pain medication, which was exactly what he did not need because of his history with substance abuse. So eventually he ended up losing his job. He ended up back with me. And as I said, then we lost him in January of 2009. My daughter, I thought, of all things, this is going to wake her up, but it didn't, because it doesn't. Addiction does not work that way. I believe there are underlying issues with individuals that have to be brought to the surface and have to be dealt with. And I try to encourage parents to stick with it, to hang in there, but do not enable, because we think that we're helping them and we are actually hurting them. So I try to stress that with parents. And because God is in charge, faith is what has pulled me through. And I have 4 children. I actually, in February of 2016, lost my second son. It wasn't to addiction. The aorta in his heart tore. I think there were some underlying medical things with his heart that were not discovered. So when I received a phone call that my son was in critical condition, it was just, the most unbelievable thing, because I'd already lost 2 children. And they had a surgery room ready, and he stopped breathing and they could not bring him back. So thus I had to bury my 3rd child. My youngest son suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, which was discovered in 2012 also, when my daughter was, kind of the addiction kind of blew out of control then. So I've learned to deal with a lot of different issues, because mental illness sometimes is also a road to the addiction, because they try to self-medicate, which my son has also, I've also been dealing with that with him. So I guess I've just had a lot thrown at me, and I think, so then when Susan called and said she had an idea and she wanted me to be a part of it, I thought, this is God's way of allowing me to give my children's voice, and speak of addiction, speak of hope, and hopefully get more help for them. That's my hope, and that's my goal with Unchained Praises. So today I view addiction in a whole nother light, because it is not what we once looked at it as. It's not a shameful thing. And I know my oldest son was shamed by it. And it's something that we should never have done. But we did, so we have to move forward with what we have now. And I thank God that people are now opening their eyes to what's really happening. Unfortunately, so many lives have been lost because of it. And I know that our statistics a few years back showed that, something like 93% of individuals afflicted with addiction receive no treatment. So today we try with Unchained Praises to lead people to detox facility if they need it, or just treatment centers if that's what their hope is and their need, because we cannot make someone do something. They have to do that on their own, and they have to do the work. But the recovery is a long road, and we need people to stick with us and just learn more and what we can do to help. So with that, I will give it back to Susan.
Well, we want to encourage you guys to fight addiction. I would like to encourage you to look at recovery and sobriety two different ways. We can take the substance away, but if we are not changing our life, then we're not in recovery. And if you've had a relapse, remember your recovery time. Today, in March 19th, I will have 5 years of sobriety time. But I claim my recovery time, so my recovery time exceeds that. And I've been the one to work for that. And so I encourage you to work for your recovery, to change your life, and to use your testimony. Your testimony is the most powerful thing that you'll have. And to share with somebody else your experiences will help them also choose the life of recovery. I want to encourage you to visit us at Unchained Praises. If you're in the Indiana area or the Kentucky area and you need help to try to better your life and work your personal recovery plan, get a hold of us. It's not just for the addict, it's for the family members too. We work a lot with mothers and fathers, with wives and husbands, because everybody doesn't understand addiction. And when Kathy said, learn the difference in enabling and motivating, that is a huge factor when it comes to the loved one of an addict. We want people to understand that addiction is out there and that the addict, they can change. We can change. And we no longer have to walk with our heads held down, but we can be proud of the people that we've become. And so we encourage you to keep fighting. We want to thank Shane for having us here, and just want to thank him for taking the time to even do the series of addiction, because there's not enough voices sharing the hope in recovery. And so we want to thank you, and have a blessed day.